Well, thank you, everyone, for coming today. And I think we'll have a few stragglers who will be joining us from the coffee cart line. And that's just fine. Here they come, little by little. If you were in church, and most of you were, you know that Don Titterington's going to share what he has gleaned about the building of this space here, this sacred space, a safe place, a sanctuary, and then also how it was refurbished about
14 years ago?
14, 15 years ago, yeah. 2008 is the year that sticks in my mind.
It was dedicated
a multi-year.
in 9. It was dedicated in 9.
That's right.
So 15 years.
Anyway, so glad to have you all here and so grateful for the heritage that we share together here at Lake Grove. In the traditional service, Don mentioned a number of names of important folks who helped make this go. Everybody who donated $1 or worshiped or prayed for the project was involved in one way or another. But there, of course, was a team of impetus that made it happen. And the number one person on that team was Dan Fox, who was retiring from Daimler-Benz, Freightliner, subsidiary. And Dan, if you are watching, we greet you and we bless you once again 15 years later for your commitment to this. You and Sandy, we miss you, and we hope that you'll come back and sing with us again sometime. But we are very grateful today for your leadership, kind of as a project manager, along with other folks like Glenn Chilcote, who of course was involved in all the architectural things that happened over the last 30 to 35 years here at the church. There was a man named Richard Shavy who was deeply involved. Jim Troisi, you mentioned today, yourself, Don Titterington, and Mark Evers, who put his name last on this. He likes to stay in the background, but he's a very effective leader in our church. We're grateful for that. And I am grateful for you and others who continue to make this church the kind of church that it is. And it is good to have a space out of which energy causes us to go and do things in our communities, in our homes. And I thank God for Lake Grove Pres. With that, I'm going to open in prayer. I'm going to open in prayer. And then you'll be fine, Don.
Remains to be seen.
Heavenly Father, I do pray for Don and his presentation, that he would not find any nervous jitters, but would relish the opportunity to share the things he's learned about this sanctuary and our church. We also pray for Dave Peterson as he shares with us in a different way here. I pray for every person who is here and the families they represent, and ask that you would bless us as members of this particular body, this kingdom outpost called Lake Grove Presbyterian, that we might not be an ingrown church only focused on worship or our Bible classes, but that those things would then lead us to be people who are sharing our faith wherever it's appropriate. So Lord, bless us one and all now as we appreciate the heritage that you have granted us, and as we also look to the future for what you yet have before us, because we will keep our eyes on the prize, the author and finisher, pioneer and perfecter of our faith, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
I have a.
Do you have one of these this time? You'll need it eventually.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Good morning, whatever it is. Hello. Well, being a creature of habit, I'm reverting to what I did professionally, which is make PowerPoint slides, and rather than read the slides, which is a pet peeve, talk to the slides. So a lot of you have copies, most of you have copies. So I'm going to be giving a lot of information that's not written down. So feel free to take notes. For what it's worth, for those listening remotely and on the video, if you want a soft copy of this, the pastors have my email address. I don't want to give it out publicly, but if you really want a soft copy of this, for whatever reason, you can get in touch with pastors and they can put you in touch with me. So I'm going to tie together Mike's talk from last month, just briefly before I start here. Think about the world between 1935 and 1975. Think about the changes that took place. It's unbelievable. Mike shared the experience of his folks getting the telegram that he was wounded in Vietnam. And one of my dad's formative experiences when he was 16 was getting out of bed and opening the door. I didn't expect to do this, but his brother had been wounded, but they didn't know. They had the telegram. And so my dad, the little house they lived in Yakima, took it into his parents' room. They just probably weren't asleep yet. It was probably 11 or something. Doesn't matter. But my grandfather was a railroad man, kind of slow, phlegmatic, steady guy. He opened it, looking at it. And my grandmother just grabbed it. I regret to inform you, your son has been mildly wounded. Well, in World War II, mildly wounded was he was in convalescence for a year, and it affected he took shrapnel in his lung and it battled the bulge. But anyway, so that's tying together some of what Mike said. I was also raised with my mother's father. He was born in 1888. He was kind of my third parents. He didn't have any means, and he kept living with us till he died. So all my formative years, which are these years, 55 to 75, my grandpa lived with us. So I got a very detailed and interesting view of what the world was like before World War II. And his son went off to fight and came back, fortunately. He was a bomber pilot, one of the few to survive, actually, in his squadron. But I had a very clear view of what life was like on the farm in the teens, the 20s, the Depression, and then the war changed everything. And something interesting in the history of the modern world, I'm sure this happened, well, it did happen in the ancient world, but at the end of World War II, we were the only economy and industrial base left standing in the world, basically. Russia was devastated, Europe was devastated, Japan was devastated, China hadn't really emerged yet. So that was a really unique time in history. And out of that came this rapid expansion of wealth. And as I said, think about the difference between 35, when they were trying to sell the church, actually. Pastors weren't being paid. And then Dr. Van Nuys, who I'm going to briefly mention, came into war for nothing, basically. Mike talked about his salary, which was nothing. He was probably at the end of his career, Mike, I don't remember, but he did this as a ministry to the church, and I'll talk about him in just a minute. But coming out of the war, our economy boomed, and with the Marshall Plan, George Marshall, who was Secretary of Defense, and I think he was the Secretary of State after that, but he had the vision that we needed to rebuild Japan and Europe rather than try to conquer and occupy them, which is Mark and I were talking about that typically was what would happen, is you would try to occupy and take that country. Well, we did something completely different, and that helped us radically because we were the only economy left standing. So the standard of living in my grandfather's life went from barely getting by and to the 70s where we were pretty affluent and laid the pipe. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of investment from both industry and the government and R&D. And a lot of things we have today came out of that time period in the 60s where we were just rapidly expanding the knowledge base. So anyway, that's the segue into this. So let me get started here. So I also subtitled it, The Church Continues to Expand. I'm going to refer you to three things. Mark probably talked about this. This is a history at 50 years of the church by Alberta Brooks Fogdall, full of information. I leaned on it heavily for those years. And then Jane Vogeland, who I don't think is with us anymore, did a wonderful job on this booklet at about 2010, so the first 80 years roughly. There's a lot of really concise and well-written information about the history of the church. So these are in the archives. There's several copies. If you're interested, I'll refer you. And then Mark just gave me this, which I probably have a soft copy somewhere, but this is Mark Evert's overview of the Sanctuary Enhancement Project, for those of you that are interested in that. Okay. The date of that one? Probably 2010. Mark, where are you? Roughly 2010. Okay, so here's an artist sketch. So I'm going to talk to these slides. Here's the conceptual sketch that the architect did before the sanctuary was built. You can see the actual physical plant, we'll call it, doesn't look anything like that, but that was the concept. The sanctuary does, however. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the design was really, really good, which I'm going to talk about. And look around, it's held up so well with the renovation that was done in particular. Here's some of the slides. Dr. Peterson, Don Peterson, had a scrapbook or a photo book with the little, I don't know if the brownie photos, but the little Kodak black and white photos, and there's like 50 of them of the direction of the church, and that's in the archives as well. I didn't have the time or space to do them all, but you can see here the construction. Yeah, it shows up pretty well. The walls being erected. There's many, many more of these. If for those of you that are interested, you can look at that book. I chose not to tear it apart to scan the photos, so you just have to deal. It was it wasn't super fragile, but I didn't want to have to try to remount all the pictures. So, and here's Dr. Peterson. The subtitle's the 70s, so this was apparently somewhere after he was here, but that was him and his wife Eleanor, Dave's mother and father. So back to Dr. Van Nuys. Dr. Van Nuys, I wish I'd have met him. He sounds like a really interesting guy, but he obviously had a heart and an ability to spot talent, and he spotted or got to know Don Peterson as a very young man, late teenager probably. I'm fuzzy on the details, but Dr. Van Nuys strongly encouraged Don Peterson to get involved in the church, and he became the associate in those years in the war. And we mentioned this last night. Mark Evers brought this up. I believe it was your dad's first sermon was preached on Pearl Harbor Day, because Dr. Van Nuys was off seeing his son off to the war, probably putting him on a train, I don't know. But so Dr. Peterson had been an associate here in the 40s, and then when he was more mature in his ministry, he was called here in 1955 and moved here. And he was the driving force behind the fundraising and choosing the architect and so forth that led to the construction of this sanctuary. And there is going to be a presentation close to the fall on the actual history of the pastors of the church, so there'll be more about Dr. Peterson then, and I'm going to probably leave it there. Come on. So here's some pictures of the fundraising. So Dr. Peterson decided to do something fairly controversial in this book, which is hire a professional fundraising outfit to help. It turns out that was a Christian organization. I think they're in California. And in Alberta's book here, Don and this, whoever the person was, I can't remember his name, became good friends over this couple-year period as they worked together. And the approach that was taken, as I say here, was pretty low-key. They're a Christian-based organization, no pressure. But they had several dinners, and this is some pictures from one of those dinners, and there are several more. But and I found it really interesting. The final cost of the sanctuary was $250,000, and it's exactly a 10x ratio, so it'd be $2.5 million today. And over that 3 years between 56 when they started and the beginning of construction, they raised 3/4 of that. And I found it interesting. The SEP, the Sanctuary Enhancement Project, cost 1.7, and by pledges we raised 3/4 of that, and then eventually paid it off. And I found this really sweet. One of the fundraising dinners is hosted by the women of the Methodist Church here in Lake Oswego. It was at the high school. So I just thought that was really, really interesting and a really nice touch. Here's the groundbreaking, and you can't see it very well, but the upper left picture, I'm pretty sure is Helen Stanton, and her mother, Mary Reese, was mentioned because Mary was Reese Road was one of the founding members of the church, and Mary Reese helped break ground on the original sanctuary, which is back behind us here. Most of you probably know that, but I actually, Connie and I are newcomers. We've been here 22 years, so I came right after the CE wing was built. I never did see the old sanctuary, but Connie was in Bible Study Fellowship and was actually in it. So, but anyway, Mary Reese helped break ground on that one, and her daughter, Helen Stanton, helped break ground on this one, and several of the other. I didn't put in all the pictures. There wasn't really room. But here's Dr. Peterson. Dr. Peterson's in the robe there. You can see him in the right picture. And several of the charter members turned over shovels of the first dirt. I just thought that was really nice. okay, I'm going to talk about the design some. Here are the glue lambs being put in. That's what these are called. They're laminated wood glued together, called glue lambs by the contractors and so forth. I've always loved these. I like working in wood, for one thing, and I'm not great on design, but I like design when I see it. So these are obviously a unifying feature of this design. Your eyes go there, and it provides a sense of space. And I was thinking about, what's it reminiscent of? Well, obviously flying buttresses, for those of you that have been to Europe. They look like flying buttresses, but there was one other thing that came to mind, which I'll share in just a minute. But you can see the artist, the architect's conceptual sketch. That's from the 50s, before the construction was started. That's what the sketch looked like, and that's how it ended up looking. And the architect was Donald Edmondson, and I just think this design is pretty timeless. I think he did a wonderful job there. It was a very good choice to hire that firm. And here's what it looked like inside on the left, upper left, right before they started construction of the interior, and that's exactly what it looked like in 2008, or late 2007, 2008, when this was stripped back, clear back to that. I'll get to that in a few minutes, but I thought that was just really interesting. So here's the color picture of the same thing with the stained glass windows. I'm not going to dwell a lot on the windows right now. I'll talk about it a little bit later. I added something here, and I might have got a couple slides out of order, so bear with me here. But I was turning on, what does this remind me of? And for those of you that have been fortunate enough to go to Normandy and been in Honfleur, France, this is the interior of the Church of St. Catherine's. It's not in, I added this, so bear with me. This is the interior of the Church of St. Catherine's, which is one of the biggest wooden churches in Europe, and it's a fishing village. It's right on the Atlantic. It's a little east of the D-Day area, but if you go to D-Day, you'd probably see Honfleur, but it's a wonderful and interesting place. There are two naves. You can't really see it, but if you look straight down there, the ceiling's a boat, because it's a fishing village, and they built it literally with the keel of a boat and the ribs of a boat, and this is what that reminds me of. And I thought I'd throw that in. It was too late to get it in the slide, so I apologize for that. Mark and I were talking about, think of all the references about boats in the life of Christ. And I think the French were interested in that, and we're interested in that, but that really is one of the unifying design features of this, and I just was very intrigued by that.
Don, tell them that this is called the nave?
Yes, yeah, and also Greg just mentioned, this is technically the nave of the church, the sanctuary, this part of the nave. The chancel, the nave, oh gosh, what's the... Narthex, yeah. Yeah, I did not know that. Thanks, Greg. So if you couldn't hear that, nave from naval, the boat, literally, if you go into Europe, that's going to the cathedrals. That's a lot of the, not all, but a lot are designed that way. Thanks, Greg. I tried really hard to find a good color picture of the finished sanctuary. I have one from the aughts, which I'll show you, but this is the best I could find. This is the sanctuary right after completion, and then you can see the back of the sanctuary in the color picture. I wanted to find a color picture, but I just couldn't. But you can see the light pouring in, which is one of the design features, and Mark Evers has been in here way more than I during the day, but you can see actually where the Yakis are, the colored lights pouring in the summer in particular when the sun is in the right place and lights up the sanctuary. It's not quite as pronounced because the pews were angled for better viewing of the pulpit. They aren't square to the building, as you can see, but anyway, I thought that was a really nice design thing as well. And finally, here's the burning of the mortgage. So I'm not going to talk about this except for this. So 50th year anniversary in 1974, they had paid off the mortgage in full, and they burned it. So I thought that was very interesting. Okay, I'm just going to briefly go through the life of the church. So Dr. Peterson was responsible for this building, but also during that time, the church continued to grow. Almost all these programs, I think, existed, the programs we know today, but during the 60s and 70s, they really expanded. The attendance, I'm trying to say, the attendance of the church rapidly expanded, the programs expanded, the facilities expanded, And it ended up in the late 70s being pretty similar in program to what we have now, with probably the exception of the mission emphasis, which Bob added. But all the programs we think of now were in existence then, from a fairly simple church in the 30s, 40s, to the church about the size we are now, and with all the ministries we have. So here's a few slides. There's another photo album made in the late 60s or early 70s of the life of the church, and I took most of these from that. So the Sunday school class for the kids, Christian education, of course. There were programs for children, youth, adult. I think there were specifically youth. Dave, were there youth services? I don't remember, but from the readings. But the Christian education was made a priority and continued to be a priority. Here's just a few pictures of the life of the church. You can't see them real well, but there's the bell choir. If you can see it, in the right side of the upper left picture, there's a bell choir. There's a rummage sale for raising missions funds or whatever it might be. And then here's some pictures of the administration of the church, some committees meeting. And, of course, the session and trustees modeled as the Presbyterian Church Jesus was in effect. The library was renovated and added to. The music program, I thought this was really interesting. It looks just like a few Sundays ago at, oh man, no, man. Palm Sunday, yes, Palm Sunday, yeah. On Palm Sunday, where the kids were singing, and the youth were singing, and the choir was singing, and that was going on in the 60s and 70s. You can see the church was full like it is today. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Glenn. Could you all hear that? Yeah, I meant to say this but in my opening remarks, but I glossed over it. So right after the war was the baby boom, and that really contributed to the growth population in the United States, but also this church in Glenn was saying there were actually several kids choirs at that time. There were tons of kids from the 50s, 60s, the baby boom, all of us basically. So that was a big part of the programs. We're going to talk about this a little. This is going to be covered. I'm not going to dwell on this, but there was originally just a Hammond console organ in the sanctuary, and along the way they installed the first organ that most of you remember. So I thought that was actually really interesting, and that'll be covered in more depth in June. So this is just a quick overview of some of the programs of the church, and I'm going to turn it over to Dave in just a minute. But I wanted to call out something else. So the planning started for the continued expansion of the church as we know it now. Here's a view of the narthex being built. The stained glass circular window that's back in the narthex, Mark asked me to specifically call this out. Tom Moore rescued that from the original sanctuary. There are 2 rose windows in the sanctuary. You can't see it. It's behind the doors there, but you can see it after the talk. You can't see it right now. Tom rescued one of those rose windows, refurbished it, and then when the narthex was built, it's installed there. So that's from the original sanctuary. I thought that was really nice. And I wanted to specifically, he might be recognized later on, but I wanted to specifically recognize Glenn Chilcutt, who was the architect for everything else except this, basically. Glenn donated probably thousands of hours to the fellowship hall, to the offices, to the Christian education wing. His files down in the archives, there's like a whole file cabinet full of Glenn's files for all the subsequent buildings. That was after my talk ends, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But I did want to call that out. So, Dave, if you.
Thank you, Don. Just looking at these pictures brings back a lot of memories for those of us, my sisters and I, who were sitting right over there for a lot of years, trying to stay out of trouble, or trying to stay under the radar while being in trouble.
In those days, the pulpit was on
Pulpit was there, yeah, on that side. And that's why we were right under my father's eye. I'm not positive about this, but I think I have a kind of unexplainable affection for the smell of concrete. I mean, fresh concrete, it's being poured. And I actually think I got it here because I got to roam around this place when it was under construction through all those years. So I'm grateful. Thank you so much for doing. It's a lot of work putting this together. And it's kind of a thankless job until years later when all of a sudden somebody needs to know. So it's great. So just a couple of comments. You've noticed I tell a lot of stories. It's not a gimmick. It's not something I've learned. It's the way my brain works. I was thinking if you go to Lake Grove Elementary School in the archives and look up report cards from the 1950s, you would see every one of my report cards had the same thing written on it. I know because we found these report cards when we were going through historical stuff a while back. David needs to learn to pay attention. My mind was always somewhere else. So for me, it's been difficult, honestly, to learn unless I can find something to illustrate it. And so I guess I kind of think of myself I like to think of myself as a biblical illustrator. Take a Bible concept, find a way to illustrate it. It works for some people, doesn't work for everybody, but hey, it's my thing. So I was thinking, I heard a couple of years ago when Garrison Keillor retired. Garrison's probably the greatest American storyteller. He made this interesting comment. He said, when you get to the end, you discover there are no answers, there are just stories. I didn't know what to make of that because I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to have answers. I mean, that's why people come to me. They come to me, I just got one of these questions the other day. It's an impossible thing. I don't know how to answer that question. But we're supposed to be answer people. And yet when I think about it, I've sort of concluded that everything that I believe anyway came as a result of an event in my life that taught it to me. So it's good to think back on stories. And so I've spent some time thinking about, I think the point is you got to figure out what kind of story you're in. Are you in a tragedy? Are you in a comedy? I think the thing we learn when we're in the body of Christ is that we're in a love story. And no matter how you come at it, sooner or later, that will be your end point. See, a lot of people think that being a Christian, you ask people on the street, what's it mean to be a Christian? I don't know what percentage, but a lot of people would say it means being good. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I got nothing against being good. But I've discovered at least that there are really only two ultimate outcomes of being good. The first is shame, because you can never be good enough, especially in comparison to God. There's no way. On the other hand, it leads to pride, and that makes us judgmental, gives us reason to look down on other people. So I've kind of wiped that whole notion of why am I a Christian, to keep the rules and be a good person. I'm kind of getting rid of that. I'm sort of to a place now where I'm thinking the point of being a Christian is to experience God in this love story. And all the little things that happen to us in life, if we look at them and follow them closely enough over a long enough period of time with openness, I think we discover that they lead us to that end point. Paula D'Arcy, a friend of mine, she said, God comes disguised as your life. I love that. God comes disguised as your life. So just a couple of stories and then I'll sit down. Some of you, probably very few of you, but some of you will remember the Columbus Day storm, 1962. Columbus Day, 1962. I remember I think it was a Friday. I came home from school. I thought, boy, it's windy. Back then, you didn't have a weather channel or anything else. We didn't know what was going on. And then it just got windier and windier, and No, it was a huge storm. It was probably the epic storm in the Pacific Northwest in history. Right across the street over here, there was a house, it was an older home, and it was crisscrossed by 4 of the huge Douglas fir trees we see around. I remember we stood on our garage door, heard a gust of wind coming across the lake, and watched 4 huge Douglas fir trees go down with one gust. It was incredible. We didn't even know what was going on. Anyway, this was a different house, and it was completely mangled by these fallen trees. Now, about that same time, there was a popular television program called, it's not One Step Beyond. What was that other one?
Twilight?
It was in Twilight Zone, yeah. The Twilight Zone. And there was one episode in the Twilight Zone. You got to hold on to me for a little while with these stories. In my mind, there is an appropriate conclusion, but I'll have to leave that up to you. So the Twilight Zone, they have one episode in the Twilight Zone where a guy finds a pair of spectacles on someone's dresser, and he picks them up and he puts them on, and it gives him the ability to see himself as he really is. And the episode ends with him in a horrified look on his face, his claws going down his streak to see, that's who I really am. We're getting closer. So I got this house with 4 trees across it. I climb up on one of those fir trees, and this was a very surreal time. You could smell the smoke of, people burning debris. We were without power for some period of time, and it was sort of spooky. Anyway, so it was late in the afternoon. I climbed up on one of these trees and walked on it to a place where I was over the bedroom. And I jumped down into the bedroom of the house, and I looked on the dresser. And there were the spectacles. I picked them up, and there was a mirror. I couldn't do it. And I honestly think there's a whole line of Christianity that makes people sort of afraid to find out who they really are. Worried that we're just all a bunch of sinners going to hell. Maybe the case. My theory is anybody who wants to go to heaven, go to heaven. That means you got to buy into the program, the heaven program. But if you don't want to go there, since love doesn't insist on its own way, God's not going to force you to go there. And my thinking is anybody who's in hell is in hell because they want to be there. It's not a place you get sentenced to because you don't want to go there. If you didn't want to go there, you'd go to heaven. Am I off? Well, anyway.
Nope.
This is not very well scripted, as you can tell. So, when you discover that the story you're living is a love story, when you realize that, you can begin to look in the mirror and see something of extraordinary value. That's what the church is. That's why we're here. Yitzhak Perlman, he's a great violinist. He had polio as a child, so when he comes out onto the stage to play, he comes out with his aluminum crutches, and I've seen him a number of times, and it's just kind of awkward to watch him come across. And he makes a bunch of noise with the rattling and all that, and sits down on a chair and slides the crutches underneath. Then he picks up his violin, and it's like he looks up to heaven, and he starts playing, and it's just so beautiful. And I look at that and I think, that's the church. The world looks at us, we're making a lot of noise out there. But at our best, we get our eyes lifted up to heaven. We discover that the story we're in is this love story. One other story, and then I'm done. I spent a lot of time in the Lake Grove Swim Park. We just lived there, it's down the hill. The park path, I lived on the park path. It was our sled run when it snowed, and I played in the woods down there anyway. I had a bike ride, a paper route, 7 miles, 90 papers. The end of it was coming up the park path. Go down the park path, go to the swim park. I had a million different kinds of jobs when I was growing up. Work ethic was kind of in our family. One of my jobs was as a lifeguard at the swim park. But to become a lifeguard at the swim park, you had to take senior life saving from the Red Cross. You had to learn how to, do all the strokes, but you also had to do the main thing was, how do you rescue someone who's drowned? This was at about exactly the time when they had discovered that there was a better way of reviving a person than that weird thing where you put them on their stomach and pull up their shoulders and put them back down. I don't think anybody was ever saved by that, but it just made you feel like you were doing something. And then somebody thought, well, I wonder if you could just actually breathe into a person, breathe for them. So they're teaching us this down at the Lake Grove Swim Park. But this was before Resuscit Annie and Resuscit Andy. Yeah, that's right. You would be arrested for doing this today. We were given pieces of gauze to breathe into each other, which is as creepy as you can imagine. However, really, the Bible says that the Word of God is spirit, which means it's wind. The Bible says that we are God's temple and God's spirit, God's wind, God's breath is within us. Now, I say all this because I didn't know this until yesterday, but Lake Grove Presbyterian Church got its start in the concession stand at Lake Grove Swim Park. Who knew? And I'm still thinking of this church as a place where, that breath of God gets into people and gives them life. All right, well, that's enough for me. Who's next?
I am next, reluctantly. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the remodeling sanctuary enhancement project. I showed you that picture before. Mark pointed out to me, I think it's over there, Mark, if I'm not mistaken. People had a chance to come in and write scripture or their thoughts. So if you were to tear those panels off on that wall, there are probably Post-its. I don't know what's in there. I remember seeing it. I don't remember what it looked like, but there's the thoughts of the congregation are right there behind that wall. This is what the sanctuary looked like right before the remodeling. That's the best picture I could find. It's very accurate. Rather than give you a boring Don version of this, Jane Vogelin did a wonderful job of summarizing what happened in the paragraphs up to the dotted lines there. So I hope you can read it. I tried to magnify it as best I could. So I am not going to, we're running low on time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. For those of you that are interested, she really concisely summarizes what happened there. But let me just quickly talk about it. So there were cedar walls here, if you remember. There was lath here. The acoustics of the room were not very good. Acoustic design probably wasn't, well, it was in its infancy, but it wasn't thought of in the 50s. So a very large amount of thinking, and actually we hired Wendy was heavily involved in hiring an acoustics engineering firm out of Colorado. I wasn't there, but I saw the results, saw the reports. A very large amount of work was done on the acoustics of the building and how they could be enhanced. So a lot of what you see here was to enhance that. So I'll start there. So the walls being smooth. I mentioned this morning the walls are slanted to bring sound back up this way. The back walls are deadened. You can see the carpet, it's not carpet, but whatever it is, the cloth there, that's to deaden the reflection coming back. And Bob was heavily involved in this part of it. I am sure you can imagine there was some controversy around many things around this design, but hiring that firm, paying them a lot of money was one of the things, but I think it's paid off. So what happened was the architect worked with them to try to optimize the design, and the electronic sound system, so those big speakers there, there's a computerized sound system here to try to optimize the spoken word in particular everywhere in the auditorium. So that wasn't very good. So there's speakers in there that are computer controlled to try to, my voice should be audible about equally all over. So that was the design goal. And obviously music was very important. Retaining the stained glass is obviously, we've talked about that. Retaining the design concept. Those beams were stripped clear back to the wood and refinished. They were kind of wood color or varnished before, if you remember, and they were stained, and that's part of the design thing. The builder is mentioned in here. I can't remember who they were. Dan Fox did all this, and again, I'm gonna call out Dan Fox's work. I've told people the church deserved to carry him around on their shoulders. I'm not kidding. Jim Teresi took all the heat. He was the head of the planning committee, but you can imagine the opinions about what we should do to the sanctuary. And Jim, I was on the committee, but Jim took the heat. If you guys know Jim gave some of it back, but that's okay. And we came to the agreement basically on what should be done. Dan implemented it all. As we mentioned, he's a mechanical engineer. He'd managed a lot of people doing very expensive stuff, so he's a very detail-oriented guy. So I'm going to start this little tour here. I think that's where I am. Yeah, I'm going to start this little tour here in the north on the chancel, which Dan integrated a bunch of man, I can't talk today. People wanted opposite things, so semi-conflicting requirements, many actually directly conflicting requirements. Dan thought and really integrated it so kind of everybody's needs got met. Maybe everybody wasn't completely happy, but everything that everybody wanted was basically included. And I'm going to take you through that just briefly, if you'll bear with me. So let's look here. So what those of you that know me, I just tell things. So you're not going to be surprised with this. There's a huge controversy over whether we should have a screen or not, or dual screens, worship songs. There's a lot of heat and fire over that. So Dan fixed this issue, at least in my mind, by thinking of this design that he did this. It's not a commercial thing. So if you look at the upper mechanism, that's a mechanism for a screen to be recessed in a ceiling. Typically that'd be framed in lumber, and that whole mechanism would be up in a ceiling, run remotely to drop the screen down. So that's on a chain lift that's behind the cross. So Dan again, and the architect came up with this idea, let's bury that mechanism, it's behind it. If you go back there's a box with the echo mechanism in there, and the motors are at the bottom. So the guys back there can run this from buttons to the electronics. So the lift takes the big mechanism up, the screen comes down, you guys have all seen that. And then we have, when it's not there, which is most of the time, we have this beautiful millwork and a cross, and then the window was installed. That window was, those of you that have been in the church, that window was not there. That window was installed as part of the upgrade to kind of match the colors of the stained glass here. Then the organ, there was controversy over how big the organ should be, what it should look like. That wasn't quite as bad as the screen, but there was a lot of discussion over that, and we ended up with this burnished or aged copper design, which is just really wonderful. And the organ designer worked with the millwork company to build the console with the same lumber, same design. The millwork company was out of Dallas, Oregon, I believe. Mark, is that right? I can't remember. Dan, of course, got to know these guys intimately, and he was here. I mean, he was here literally every day when this was being reconstructed, and probably during the demolition too. I was working, and it was a pretty stressful time in my personal life. My parents were sick and so forth, and I was working hard. And I was on the committee, but I was in here maybe once a week. Dan would kind of take us through. Dan did it. I mean, Richard Shavey, who's no longer with us, is an architect, Glenn and I, and Richard and Glenn could actually contribute more. I was helping manage things, and I ended up being the elder right after the construction for the building and grounds. So I was kind of helping manage it a little bit, but Dan was here every day, got to know the millwork guys. No, that's not good enough. You need to redo that. So let me show you a little bit about the chancel. So again, the choir risers, that's not a commercial thing. Dan designed and probably helped build it. So those things are on casters, like the old gym risers that fold in and then you pull them out. So when the kids are doing programs or whatever, those are pushed back. And so we have the whole platform here to use for plays and whatever. And in addition, I'm sure you all have seen this, where I'm standing, there underneath there, there's additions to the platform to fill this out for when we have the symphony people, and when he has maybe 15 people up here, there's room for the musicians. So you can imagine the talk about, well, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. We can't stand this, can't have that. Jim Teresi deserves a vote of thanks because he navigated most of that. Dan, I hope Dan's listening. They moved to North Carolina, as I mentioned. Hope he's listening. Dan made it all happen and thought through how to make all this work. And it's really held up. It's 15 years old now. It's dinged up a little bit, but it's just really beautiful, and I'm really proud to have been part of it when I walk in here. Let me talk just a little bit about the nave here. Slanted walls, I mentioned. There were asbestos tiles on the floor, if you remember, and I think some carpet. I just can't remember, but they put visqueen all around, and it was a hazard area for several weeks. Well, we had a hazmat crew, I believe. Mark, is that right? Remove the tiles. Asbestos isn't poisonous, it's an inhalation. I'm a chemist, so bear with me. Asbestos isn't poisonous, it's fine needles. And when you inhale them, it's not chemically reactive in any way, but those fine needles are just the right size to plug up the alveoli in your lungs. That's what causes the lung cancer. So anytime asbestos is being demolished, people need to wear the suits to keep them from getting it on their arms and subsequently, and breathing it. So guys in the hazmat suits and respirators were in here ripping everything out down to the concrete, and then the tiles were put in. And a decision was made to make the pews slant a little bit to make it easier to focus on the center of the chancel. So that's about it. Mark, have I missed anything of significance? I don't think so. So if you have questions, I'd be glad to field them. The ones that I can't answer, I'll refer to others. Glenn.
I just wanted to mention the bell loft.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, and Dan the bell loft was put in. That was all accommodated. That's a beautiful space back there. Because I was speaking, I'm normally in the middle of the choir with the baritones, and I had to be back there in that corner. The acoustics back in that corner are incredibly good. It's really interesting. There's an acoustic hotspot right back there. I could hear the sopranos better than I normally hear them. It's really good. But there's a good space, as you know, there's a good space for the bell choir and fold-out tables to accommodate the bell. Sorry, Glenn, I should have mentioned that.
When we have guest conductors here, I show them that because most churches don't have 40 feet of bell space.
Yeah. There is a modesty screen that we don't use. You can see the fixtures on the floor that was designed, and I think it gets in the way, basically, and it's not really needed. Yes?
Didn't we elevate and fill in the organ hole during the enhancement? And so we're able now to move this organ?
Yeah, the organ was designed, it's movable, yeah, it's electronic, of course. There's cables back to the controls that control the pumps that run the air and so forth. Also, we needed to accommodate the ADA Act, Disability Act, so most of you probably know there's a lift. There needed to be access to the platform for disabled people, so there's actually a lift over there behind these doors, a little elevator that can accommodate wheelchairs, which is another thing. Yes, Bruce?
I've always been curious about the two little windows.
Oh, I was going to mention that. Yeah, sorry. So those were air vents. In the original sanctuary didn't have air conditioning. And so they would open those up in the summer. And the architect said, hey, what are we going to do with those? We didn't want to have to redo the roof, so let's put colored glass in there. So that's what that's about. Yeah. Yes, Terry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's great that you're still a member here after all the work you've done.
I don't think I mentioned it this morning, but my daughter was married here. All my grandkids were baptized here. And I've had, like we did this morning, so many wonderful experiences singing in here. I have a deep connection to this place. It was my pleasure. It was really my pleasure. Anything else? I know it's Mother's Day. We need to probably. Yes.
One more clarification. The screen, does that sink down?
No. So what happened? Yeah, Mark, will you run the screen? Or can someone run the screen? Is Mark here? Will you run the screen? I'm done. Just run the screen. You can kill the projector also. There's a very minor downside of this is it takes quite a while and it's pretty noisy. So the people who run the services tend to try to take that into account. A year ago Christmas, a robe got caught. one of the bases in the back there. Yeah, there's a space for it you can't see back there. It goes down into a framed out space, basically. Yeah, Glenn.
A couple of bell choir coats have gone up.
What's that? Oh, the coats have gone up. Hopefully none of the bell choir have gone up. But that's how it works. Yeah, the chain. There's a chain mechanism. There's a circular chain mechanism with gear. There's gears up at the top, and then a big motor down behind the chancel. Isn't that a wonderful design and piece of engineering? And Dan, that's all Dan. No one else really thought he was able to help him. I'll let you go unless someone has a burning question. Going? Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's my pleasure.